My name is Keaton Dodd. I am the Genetics and Customer Service representative here for BRCRATA Incorporated. Through some of, I guess, my paths to get me here, I spent quite a bit of time in College Station at Texas A&M. I was the livestock judging coach there, as well as spent a good bit of time studying Brahman pedigrees and information. And so we'll get a chance to really go over some of the things that I went through and studied when I was in graduate school. And hopefully it's informative, but more importantly than just story time, hopefully that there's something we can all gather out of this to apply back in our operations as we see fit. So history of the American Brahman, we'll go ahead and get into it and talk about some of the things that I guess, to me, we need to get into before we go over pedigrees or anything like that. And so we'll start with just a brief history. And you'll see me say early Brahman a lot of times, but in this particular instance, we're speaking of Brahmins before the big impact of MANSO. So the very, very early imported animals. And then we'll discuss some of the key bulls directly past MANSO, some of his sons, grandsons, and then we'll move on past that point into animals that are a little more recent. And so we'll get right into it. We need to start with just a brief history. And so before we talk about animals individually, let's talk about a few figures that impacted the Brahman breed. Dr. James Bolton Davis, and I'm sure some of y'all that are historians of agriculture and Brahman cattle have heard that name before. To me, he's one of the most impactful people in the ag industry in the history of the United States. And what he did, not only was he the first person to have Bos Indicus bred cattle touch the United States, he was given a pair of bulls that came from the Sultan of Turkey as a gift, but also big impact on the state of Texas and agriculture. He also brought the first Angora goats to the United States. Unfortunately, there are very little descendants of those cattle. As a matter of fact, we lost pretty much all of the influence of Dr. Davis's cattle through the Civil War. And we're going to pause for just a second. I guess we're having some technical difficulties. Looking for the button. How do I? There we go. Sorry, I guess I took over as host, and so I got to make sure that I'm letting people in. So I'm going to be watching that while we're talking. Okay, but we moved on. So we just discussed, I skipped forward one slide too many. We just discussed Dr. Bolton and how important he was. South Carolina actually was where the first Bos Indicus cattle touched down in the United States. We move on and talk about barrow grade cattle. And a lot of people would consider the term grade is kind of a negative connotation. In this situation, I really don't see it as that, but these were the starting of what would become modern Brahmins in the very, very basic form. We hear grade, and we also often kind of consider that as lower quality, commercial, non-registered. With these cattle, that was the option that we had when we had only male breeding stock to start. We had to grade them up through breeding them to cattle of the United States. And so a lot of times people don't think of it this way, but it was probably animals that were heavily Texas Longhorn influenced and stuff like that. And so these barrow grade cattle became famous. Their reputation in the South really set up where Brahman cattle are today. And so we have a lot to thank for Mr. Barrow. He's from St. Francisville, Louisiana. I'm sure plenty of y'all know where that is. We're talking just northeast of Baton Rouge there on the eastern side of the state. But those barrow grade cattle did a lot for the start and kind of moving us into where we're going to see here next. Okay, Frost and Montgomery. If there's any takeaways from these two fellas, gentlemen from Houston, and they went through a lot of effort to get some bulls brought in from India. And if you get a chance to kind of read further, and we won't go too far, but if you get a chance to read further about those two guys, you can really hear about the hardships that it took for them to get these bulls into the United States. But what they did and why they're important for this conversation, those two guys were the first people to concentrate Bos Indicus bloodlines. And so how they did that, so they got these two imported bulls, Khedive and Richard III, and they bred those to those barrow grade cattle that I talked about earlier that were out of Bos Indicus bulls, some Gujarat and Malur type cattle, with maybe some native breeding. We'll move on from there. Okay. Now you hear a lot of people talk about Brahman cattle having some circus influence, and although that sounds maybe like a negative thing, I think it's an interesting part of their history. And there was a significant impact of cattle that came from specifically the Hagenbeck Animal Show. And one bull that came from there that's pretty well known is Prince, and Prince came to us in 1904. He was put into that A.M. McFadden herd, and then Dr. William States Jacob also got some cattle out of there. And I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Jacobs, and we'll talk about some of the other stuff that he's done as we continue through here. All right, let's talk now about specifically the importations, and there's three major importations that we need to keep in mind to kind of keep ourselves categorized and know the era we're talking about. The very first major importation of Brahman cattle happened in 1906, okay, and in 1906, Thomas O'Connor and A.P. Borden set up this project to get these Indian cattle brought into the United States, and they actually quarantined these cattle in New York. And through this time, obviously, you can understand the difficulty of getting cattle just from the United States to Mexico, but bringing cattle directly from India into the New York harbor and then quarantining them, there was some trials and some tribulation. They ended up actually losing 18 head of the 51. So they ended up only having 30 bulls and 3 cows to breed on. And so they brought those back to their particular ranches, and that was really the beginning of starting cattle that we now know as Brahman. And at this point, Brahman was more of a slang term than anything. They didn't really have that name at this particular instance, but these were Bos Indicus cattle that came directly from India, heavily based around some Gujarat bloodlines, but keep in mind, as we continued and the Lord cattle made their introduction, as we get into some of these later importations, we get some of our Gir cattle, our Indo Brazil, and then depending on who you discuss with, even some Krishna Valley cattle kind of find their way into the bloodlines that we'll talk about in the future. The big one to me, and one you need to remember as we start talking about some of these influential bulls, because their dads came out of this next session. So the 1926 or 1924 and 25 Ruffier and Marias importation is where we got the largest number of cattle across into the United States. And those cattle actually were drove from Mexico into Texas. Okay, and so they had to go through, there was actually some situations where they had to hide these cattle from the Mexican army so that they could bring them together and push them into the United States. And so this was a big, big start for a lot of the Brahman ranches that you think of as historical outfits. And so this is where those cattle that became the groundwork for J.D. Hudgens came from. Dr. William States Jacob, as y'all know, the great bull Manso from the Sartwell brothers, well, they got their cattle, and specifically Manso's dad, and we'll talk about him here in a minute, from this particular importation. And Ed Lassiter, if you're not familiar with the Lassiters and what they've done for American cattle and their Beefmaster herd. So this is a very, very important importation. And the last importation that we'll discuss, okay, before we start getting into cattle, I just want to lay some groundwork, and then I really want to start talking about some of these impactful individuals. But the last importation was the 1946 importation, okay? And I always like to think of 1946's importation as like, this is where the red cattle got made. This is how we really started to kind of influence those red cattle, and this was from some of those Gir bulls and some red Indo Brazil bulls coming in this group. And so the Garcia brothers are some that brought Joe Pate, and then the Guerras actually got some of their original cattle from this group that came over in 1946. All right, let's get into impactful ancestors. Aristocrata, 134. Okay, that number through all the stuff, that's the one that always pops up into my head. 134, he's a son of Bayro out of Argenta, okay, and those are parents that he was directly imported. And so what I'm saying is he was born in India in 1921, and he was brought as a 3-year-old into the United States. And interesting enough, the Sartwells got him and put him directly to work, and then the rest is history. And we'll talk more about MANSO as we get into it. But you look at that bull, and there's some features that you can certainly see in modern Brahman cattle but boy, we've got a lot of work to do as far as some of the breed character features, adding a little bit more bone and muscle mass and body dimension. But that bull, you can make an argument, since he's the sire of MANSO, may be the most impactful Brahman in history. We move into another bull who I also think is very, very important to discuss, Imperator. That name should sound very familiar to a lot. Sartwells have kind of used Imperator as kind of a slogan of theirs, talking about him specifically, Imperator. His biggest impact were some of those really, really good sons that he made. And so one of those, King of Kaplan, okay? Y'all might be familiar with the name King of Kaplan. King of Kaplan was owned by the Marceaus there in Kaplan, Louisiana, which is kind of south there, really actually south of I-10, so almost kind of to the Gulf Coast. And so King of Kaplan became very, very influential in kind of the Marceau breeding program, and then what ended up being the Saint Cyr, a Brahman herd. So King of Kaplan became very, very important. Imperiste, also very, very important bull. Okay, now we'll get into, I actually have some pedigrees mapped out that I'll show you at the end of this, but Moroto is a bull to remember, okay? And everybody's got their own opinions, and I think that's important that we kind of build our opinions off of fact. And looking at a lot of the information that I've been given through my studies, Moroto, outside of maybe MANSO, could arguably be the most impactful Brahman bull of all time. And I will show you a diagram that will really map that out for you, and you can start to see what I'm saying. But Moroto sired, he's sired Moroto Jr., the old Suva bull. Don't confuse him with 203, but the original old Suva bull. Okay, and then he was the grandsire on the maternal side of TIPPU the Great. So before 1925, I don't think many historians of the Brahman breed would argue that he could possibly be the most impactful bull in top 2 or 3 in impact of all time. And so remember Moroto. As far as phenotype, I don't think we're that far off. You look at a picture of that bull, some breed character features, his masculinity reads really good. I like him in regards to having some body depth. That looks like a bull that still has some fleshing ability. Probably needs just a little more bone. Maybe not the most muscular bull if we compared him to some of today's cattle, but I think there's a lot of features that came from him as you study modern phenotype. TIPPU the Great, that's a really cool picture, actually. Me and Brandon were looking through some stuff this morning, and he sent me that picture. TIPPU the Great, I talked about, he was a grandson. He wasn't sired by Moroto. He's a grandson, and he's out of that Hattie Cleo cow. And we talk about bulls all the time. It seems like it's a discussion of bulls, but that Hattie Cleo cow, if I could have found a picture of her, that would have been a female to talk about. As we go through this slideshow, regretfully, at this point in time, not a whole lot of people took pictures of their cows. And it was all about the herd bull. And so I don't have a whole lot of pictures to talk about the female, but great livestock breeders will all agree that's probably just as important or more important than is the female instead of sire selection. QUINCA the Great, sired by the original QUINCA. He went to work actually for Howard Parker. A lot of these cattle ended up in the old V8 ranch for Mr. Parker, and so we'll see a lot of these cattle in pedigrees today. Next one, and I studied under Dr. Jim Sanders. I'm sure many of you on this are familiar with Dr. Jim Sanders, but those that aren't, animal breeding legend, genetics guy, huge fan and friend of the Brahman breed, and he used to teach in his grad school genetics class about anxiety, the Hereford bull, and North Pole. And he used to say that it was a shame everybody talked about anxiety and not enough people gave love to North Pole, because North Pole made all of those good daughters that we bred anxiety to. Rodrigo is kind of that in this situation. He slides under the radar, but a lot of those first generation MANSO sons that were so successful are either out of a MANSO daughter or they're out of a Rodrigo daughter. And so I challenge you, if you get the chance to really look back at old pedigrees, you can see some of the impact that Rodrigo had. Oops. And we get to MANSO, registration 162. born in 1928. Keep in mind, that's not when he went to work for J.D. Hudgens. He spent a little bit of his time, and I'm sure you've watched the video of Coleman Locke talking about the story of MANSO. I've seen it. We've all seen it, so we won't go too far into it, but just so anybody that's on this call doesn't really remember that story or missed it at some point. So MANSO was sold actually as a commercial bull, and I hope we don't look at that negatively. Some people think of the term commercial bull as maybe not worthy of seed stock production, but this bull was far from just a commercial bull. And he ended up working in Francitas, Texas for Mrs. Gale, okay? And Mrs. Gale used MANSO heavily and kept a lot of his daughters, and so she was having a difficult time using him. She was running out of utility for the bull because literally her whole herd was starting to go back to MANSO. She approached the folks at J.D. Hudgens specifically requesting that they trade her. They need this MANSO bull and she needs a new bull because she's run out of animals to breed him to. And they basically said, well, how about you take him to the sale barn or the packer, bring that money back and buy a new bull. And thankfully, Mrs. Gale had a little bit of fight in her, and she stood her ground and continued to basically plead them to come look at this bull. And out of respect for this lady and kind of her perseverance, they made the drive, and Coleman will talk about it. It was only 45 minutes, but 45 minutes in the early 1930s might be like driving to Oklahoma City now. And so that was quite a task, and it was really, really nice of them to go do that. And upon seeing that bull, they made a deal and actually ended up swapping 4 bulls to Mrs. Gale in return for MANSO, and the rest is history. And so MANSO, heavy Gujarat influence, but a lot of people will talk about potentially his mother Penelope, right? So he's out of Aristocrata. We talked about Aristocrata earlier. His mother Penelope is out of President Wilson, okay, and an unknown cow. Unfortunately, that's not in the Brahman registry anymore. But there's people that talk about maybe Penelope being very, very Nellore based. And so that's kind of how we ended up with that magic cross and the look of a Brahmin where we end up today. MANSO had a lot of similarities, and he was a changer at this time because they didn't have a bull as thick. They didn't have a bull with his kind of body mass, and then his docility really did a lot for the Hudgens herd and just Brahman cattle in general moving forward. Here are some direct sons of MANSO. Okay, and so MANSO went to work fast. And I don't know the exact number. I'm sure we could find it pretty easily of how many sons and daughters went into Hudgens and kind of became producers. But keep in mind, the amount of sons that he had breeding cows is incredible considering there was no embryo transfer at this point in time. These were natural serviced calves that he made, and they went into production. On the far left, we've got a picture of one of his sons, Risotto MANSO, who looks a lot like his sire, maybe even just a shot more powerful. But Risotto MANSO at 11 years old, they took that picture. The next one over is Aristocrat MANSO. Keep in mind Aristocrat MANSO because he comes back into play when we talk about another very influential bull, REXCRATA'S MANSO. But Aristocrat MANSO was a Houston champ 3 years running. He won Houston in 36, 37, and 38. And I think a distinctive feature that you can tell on him is he's got that half white, half black kind of look there to his sheath. You can see in all of his pictures. And that bull had a lot of phenotype features that we can attribute today in terms of making cattle that are rugged and have some fleshing ability, because that's a really, really big body, kind of a moderate framed bull in comparison to maybe some of the cattle that we'd seen previous. And then the next one, and a lot of people might turn their nose up at the thought of this, but at this point in time, when we didn't have the ability to do embryo transfer, AI, the best way to maximize the genetics of an influential animal was to breed him to a relative, specifically a daughter. And so Manamoso MANSO, the first national champion Brahmin, is that. They needed a way to basically an insurance policy for MANSO. What do we do if MANSO happens to die? And so their way of covering themselves in that situation is we need to make somebody as closely related to MANSO as we possibly can. And so with foresight, they made Manamoso Manso by breeding Manso to a direct Manso daughter. And that was the first national champion Brahman bull. Okay, and so I think that that can teach you a lot just kind of about animal breeding and some applications going forward. We move on, and I told you we don't get much love for the female in this slideshow, and I had to make sure I put a few cows that I thought were influential. This one's a big one, Lula Manso, okay? And Lula Manso, for obvious reasons, was very, very influential. Specifically, okay, we have to keep in mind that this time we did not have the ability to flush a cow, embryo transfer, IVF cycle, those kind of things. And so what they made was on their own merit of a natural calf, and look at the amount of herd bulls that she put back into production. And then 535 over 5, who was the mother of Cutler. And so in her period of raising natural calves, she made that many herd bulls for Hudgens. And so I don't know if people realize how impressive that is for a female who doesn't have the opportunity to enter kind of an embryo transfer program. And so very, very good cow, Lula Manso. Okay, there's another one of her ancestors. So that's Rachu Manso. I love that picture, like his horns and his hump, and that picture kind of screams Brahman bull to me. I like that bull a lot, but you can see where Lula comes into play, as well as a grandson and granddaughter at the top right of that screen. And so a cow that I thought was very influential and needed some attention in this slide set. All right, we're going to kind of jump, and we've spent a lot of times talking about J.D. Hudgens cattle, and rightfully so. Manso, the impact was great. But we also want to kind of diversify and talk about cattle across the South. And one thing that we did is we were able to basically kind of keep genetic lines a little separate. And I'll talk about how that's not completely true. But over in Florida, they were doing some really, really good things as far as breeding efficient, very, very useful Brahman cattle. And they were just a little bit different, a little spinoff from maybe some of the stuff that we had in Texas. Okay, and we'll start with Partins. Okay, and for those that know kind of the story of Henry O. Partin, he is basically, I thought it was kind of funny when I was talking about this. I put this together this morning. He is a culmination of probably the most Western culture you can imagine on the East. He's as cowboy as they come. He's famous for his dogs. He was famous for his horses. And he was really, really famous for the quality of his Brahman cattle. And east of the Mississippi, there's no question that Partins maybe are the most influential on Brahman cattle in Florida. They were in Osceola County, Florida. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody's on this. I believe that's like Orlando, right there, like around Disney World. And so it's hard to think of that as like big cow country, but it actually is. And he kind of revolutionized Brahman cattle in that area, and the Partin family. Now, a lot of them have moved to Texas, but those cattle are still very, very good and productive. Their most famous bull, and you'll hear lots of people talk about Emperor 200, and you look at those two pictures, he was Mr. Partin's prize bull. Said that that bull was never beat at a show he went to. And honestly, you look at that picture of him, I see a lot of similarities, the top left specifically, to that bull in Manso. I think just their phenotypes very, very similar. Okay. He is a grandson of that real good Imperator, or the Imperator bull that we talked about. So he'd be related to King of Kaplan. Interesting enough, and I discussed some of this earlier today when we were talking about some of these really cool stories and just how you wish you could have been a fly on a wall in situations. So Emperor actually made a little bit of a trip to Texas, and he bred cows on the Hudgens Ranch there in the late 1940s, and he rode on the trailer with King of Kaplan. And so both of those bulls came this way to Texas and did a little bit of work for Hudgens. And so although we like to say that Partins and Hudgens cattle are very, very distinctively different genetically, there was some crossover between the two. And today you'll still certainly see a little bit of Manso and some Partin cattle. And if you look back at all of these Hudgens pedigrees and get far enough back, you'll see Emperor 200 in there also. So I thought that was kind of a neat thing to discuss about. And then we move on to Clewiston, Florida. And just to mention the Sugar Corp and what they did for the Brahman breed is huge. And they eventually ended up dispersing, but not before bulls like Albacrata Junior 37, Sugarland's REXCRATA 1 229 over 3. Okay, those bulls, those are just two that are quickly mentioned, and we'll see where maybe Rex Crata comes back into play and some later ancestry. But I thought that bull, or those pair of bulls, stood out in the sugar corporation's kind of herd as some that had the most impact. And I'll show you where they kind of line up on a pedigree I've drawn out here after a while. All right, moving on to the next generation. I guess to me, we carried from MANSO for a while, and Rexay MANSO 1/5 was the next big thing. He kind of turned us in even another gear and made cattle that much better. And if you look at that picture of that bull, it's almost kind of one of those situations where you really wish you could jump in a time machine because part of me wants to put him in the beds next to some of the bulls that we're hauling around now and just see what he looks like, because boy, he's awfully high quality. And I attribute some of the modern kind of features of body and moderation and still the way they balance and proportion. That bull does a lot of things that I see in cattle still today. And so he was a great grandson of MANSO out of Aristocrat MANSO 20th and a REXCRATA daughter. Okay, and that's Rexay MANSO 1/5. He was also a champion of many shows, and you can see there on the right where he won the State Fair Texas in 1949. Okay, then we move into key Brahmans of the 50s. Okay, and there's a list of a few of those bulls, and we already talked about Rachu MANSO, and if you remember, that's a grandson of that good Lula MANSO cow, but we've got that bull specifically, and then Rex Premium MANSO, Swato Man MANSO, and Dr. Sanders talks about how good that bull was from a phenotype perspective, and Swato Man MANSO will show up specifically on the bottom side of a lot of pedigrees because he made some really, really good cows there for Hudgens in the kind of mid-50s range. Okay, we move into influential sires of the 60s, and I actually really admittedly put this picture at the bottom on this slideshow today. I didn't have this picture, and Brandon sent me this picture, and we kind of joked about that bull has a place right now, and if we had the ability to breed a cow Gamble to MANSO 55, I think we would probably do it. That's the biggest boned, stoutest, most massive bull that we've discussed to date. And so here in the mid 60s, I think that bull was a big changer for adding some substance to those cattle. And that's why I think he shows up so much, is he's different. You look at him in comparison to even the great Maru above him. When we talk about bone and muscle and feature, that bull's just a little further, a little more progressive than even Maru. And so I really, really like that picture. And I think that's a bull that would still be good today. And so Loxy Gamble to MANSO 55. Remember him going forward. Okay, we move into some of the ranches that maybe don't get quite as much attention, but if you really study pedigrees and you're familiar with some of those influential cow families, these names aren't new to you. Frank Buffalo and Buffalo Cattle there in Victoria County, and that family is still in the ranching business. If you know any of the Buffaloes, they've transitioned actually into the Red Brangus breed, but Buffalo at that point in time made a lot of good cows. Okay, and so Buff's Lady Lass 704, for instance, is the dam of Whitaker's REXCRATA 262, and we'll talk about some Whitaker cattle as we go. But so many good cows came from Frank Buffalo. But I read somewhere actually, and I'm not sure who I was talking to or discussing, but the portion where it says champions from 50 to 59, I believe it was 5 of the champion bulls from 1950 to 1959 were sired by Buffalo bulls. So that's a pretty good thing that maybe flies under the radar because they weren't Buffalo cattle itself winning, but they were out of Buffalo breeding. And so Frank Buffalo, Victoria, look them up if you get a chance, and they're still in the industry, like I said, raising nice Brangus cattle. But those cattle did a lot for kind of pedigrees as we see going forward. Next ones we'll talk about, I told you we'd get into Whitaker, okay? And these Whitaker cattle are good. I really, really want to kind of show y'all a comparison when I get to the end and relate modern pedigrees to the cattle that made them that way, and we'll kind of get a peek back at some of these older pictures, and I think it'll really open some eyes to maybe how much we've taken from some of these cattle. But these Whitaker cattle as far as body and moderation and doability, those look like really, really good cattle to me. I told you earlier the Sugar Corporation would come back into play, okay? And these are a lot of sugarland breeding, specifically REXCRATA 1. Like I told you, that bull was going to be influential as we continue down the line. And a lot of him that you see in modern pedigrees comes through these bulls that came from Whitaker. All right, a bull that we are all probably very, very familiar with, and actually over the past couple of weeks has come up in conversation a lot of times, and I don't think we'll ever forget about Suva 203 and what he's done for this business. As you look, you start to notice, well, cattle trends have maybe changed, and successful phenotype has drifted just a little bit to a bull that's got more frame, a bull that's got more natural grow and performance and extension built into him. But Suva, there's no way that you can argue that he's not in the argument with even REXCRATA, MANSO, and some of those older bulls for being the most influential, because he is the bull who's #1 in terms of register renowned. Look at some of the progeny that he's put into the industry. You look at 700/3 and some of the things that that bull has done, 883/2. Those are direct offspring or grand stock specifically of the great Suva 203. We look at the very bottom, and it's interesting, and it goes to show what we can do selectively by positively reading through phenotypes and making mating decisions. So Suva is double bred Mr. V8 666. Interestingly enough, 666 is a REXCRATA grandson. So there's a heavy influence in Suva from REXCRATA MANSO, but you look at phenotype and he couldn't be more different if we were just talking about the type of bull from REXCRATA MANSO. And so positive selection for frame size, mature kind of hip height. We changed cattle, but Suva did a lot for the business. And I know that most of us are aware of the impact that bull had. Okay. We move into some of the JEFFCOAT cattle, and so Johnny there in Louisiana did a really, really good job kind of helping transition more frame into our cattle. He made them muscular. He made them grow in a lot of those bigger framed, kind of more rugged cattle that we've become familiar with. And some of these pedigrees came from a lot of these JEFFCOAT cattle, and specifically we're talking about CRATA 389 and 500, and we see both of them. See my mouse? I think I can see my mouse. My mouse is pointing at 389 on the right, and then there's 500 on the left. But those JEFFCOAT cattle did a lot as far as changing that type, and we were transitioning. This is a transitioning period, and we saw it through all of our breeds, but specifically Brahman was no different. We started to add just a little more stretch, just a little more growth into these cattle, and it shows up in those bulls. We talked about a couple days ago, we were talking about some of these really influential bulls and some of the outcross bulls that Hudgens went out and used to add a little bit of diversity genetically to their cattle. And everybody kept saying, oh, the BOZO bull, and we were talking about it. And I had to kind of sit back for a second because I didn't know him through looking at pedigrees as BOZO. I knew him as Sugar CRATA 45, but common name BOZO as he went by, did a lot for Hudgens, and it'll show as we get further into the slide set. Remington is the son of BOZO, and I'll talk about it here as we get into it with Remington, the impact, and I'll show you a modern pedigree of one of the animals that we have here at BRC and how much of an impact Remington has, and I think it'll blow some people's minds. But BOZO came from Jack Keel, okay? He's out of that Whitaker 402, okay? And he's, like I said, those good buffalo cattle will keep showing up. He's a grandson of one of those good buffalo cows. And so a different phenotype, honestly. We just kind of went through some of those JEFFCOAT cattle. We talked about 203. I don't see this bull quite as big. And I see him having just a shot more natural body depth. But still can't take away kind of either of those types and what they did for the business going forward. And then we get into Remington, and I wrote up there maternal powerhouse because that's it. That's exactly what he was. On the female side, he shows up so many times, and he sired the mother of Madison. He sired the grandmother of KARU, and I think that in itself, for those that know Madison and KARU, are some of the more modern greats. We're talking 85 on, and he shows up on the maternal side in both of those pedigrees. And so maybe if you're at home looking through some of your kind of cow families, start linking up some of these Remington cows and where Remington fits into your program, because he's obviously shown quite a bit of longevity as far as making cattle that are good. But so he is specifically out of that Bozo bull we talked about. So he's got Sugarland, he's got Whitaker, he's got Jack Keel, and he's got those buff cattle on the top side. And then we kick back to that bottom side and we see greats like Maru. And then we see MANSO, who once again, I think is in the running for probably being on the Brahman Mount Rushmore with his great grandsire MANSO. And so those good cattle will keep showing up, and selection on positive phenotype obviously showed up. The good ones that were national champions got bred to a lot of cows, and those are the pedigrees that you constantly kind of see as we move forward. Another one that we should be very familiar with, Mr. V8 202/3. And we just talked about how Remington sired the mother of Madison. Well, here's the bull that made the other half of that formula happen. And this is another one of those we talked about, Suva having kind of a little bit different of a body type. Mr. V8 202/3 was very much a different body type from the earlier Brahmans. We talked about packing some performance, growth, a really, really good look in terms of streamlined profile and extra quality. That bull did a lot out of Atari and a Sugarland cow. And look back there, I would consider 202/3 to be a bull that had some bone and some ruggedness. And you see back there in his pedigree, Loxy Gamble to MANSO 55, that bull that we talked about showing through in regards to adding some bone and mass. And then the Elefante MANSO bull there on the top side of his pedigree, another bull that's going to help add some of that performance and size that you find in 202/3. Very, very influential. A lot of his influence came through his direct progeny, specifically Madison, and where Madison fits in as we continue. But we talked about this being somewhat a little bit ironic as we consider what you can do by selecting phenotype. You can really change them just in this. And so I didn't even trace back any of the other pedigrees other than his paternal grandsires, both of them. Okay. And so that's not to say that it's not the same in all the other ones too, but both of those cattle trace back to MANSO in a pretty quick fashion. And so I would assume, I skipped too far, sorry. I would assume that probably every single one of those parents does that. And so the magnitude of what MANSO did on the modern phenotype is really, really neat. Okay, 700/3. And when I gave a similar kind of a talk about Brahman pedigrees, we had talked about 700/3 was very, very influential because that semen was made available for a lot of customers and everybody was using him. He was popular. Not to date myself, but he was the national champion bull the year I was born. So 700/3. He's a great grandson of Suva. Okay, and so you can see kind of that Suva bloodline pushing forward in 700/3. Keep these numbers in mind. I'm going to start showing you how this all kind of clicks together. But he was known for having a good carcass and obviously won the international. His phenotype was exceptional. Let's see, hold on. We got somebody in the waiting room. Okay. We'll move on. If I can get it over. Hold on just a second. I'm froze. There we go. Into another one of those bulls that I talked about. Every now and then, JDH would reach out, find an outcross bull, and put it into their program to add some diversification to their bloodlines. In this instance, and so we talked about the Bozo bull earlier. In this instance, came in the form of a bull from Tic-Tac-Toe. So Tic-Tac-Toe Ranch, Mr. Suva CRATA 450. They used him and they made Data Pack. And Data Pack, we'll see a picture of Data Pack here in a second. He's a different looking kind of a bull. He changed the way some cattle looked. And if you talk to Dr. Jim Sanders, he'll tell you some of the best females he's ever seen in production were those good Data Pack daughters. And so I wasn't old enough to see any of them myself, but I see how it shows up in pedigrees as we study back, 3, 4, 5 generations on some of these cattle. But Suva CRATA 450, Tic-Tac-Toe Ranch, that bull did a lot in terms of helping JDH find a little bit of an outcross to change their cattle. I don't know why it's not clicking over. There we go. All right, move on into a great, right? This one is an all-time great. Another one of those bulls that we talked about, potential Mount Rushmore cattle. We talked about MANSO. I confessed my love for Moroto. We all know I'm a fan of REXCRATA'S MANSO, but this one's another one of those bulls that needs to be considered on your Mount Rushmore. And that's another one of those bulls, if you're looking at concentrating some bloodlines, try to make sure your cattle have a decent bit of Madison in them. 737/4 was a son of 202/3. And like I talked about, maternal powerhouse, Remington MANSO on the cow side. But that bull, as far as, I mean, you can look at the picture. That's a beautiful presence of a bull in terms of look and still muscularity. Really, really good breed character. Madison does a lot. Sired Berkman, sired Lincoln, grandsire of Woodman, who was then the sire of Woodson. And so we start to see the trickle-down effect of what Madison did. Remington 202/3, it just becomes a big spider web. Okay, we move into talking about some of the more modern Hudgens bulls and some of these that became pretty impactful. Okay, we look up to the top left. That's old Liberty. Okay, Liberty then comes into play, making Woodman there in the middle, and then Woodman comes into play, making Woodson. So we've got national champion in 03, national champion in 07, all in kind of a direct lineage there. And we start to see a major type change. Woodman and Woodson specifically, I think those bulls represent a different kind of cattle that we'd seen winning there in the late 90s to mid 90s. Those bulls really represented a good expression of making sure cattle were practical beef bulls, and those two were certainly that. I told y'all that Data Pack bull, like Dr. Sanders said, that thing made some really good females, but he's a different looking character. And if you look, and I said, which ones looks different? You would immediately go to the bull on the top right. That's Data Pack. And his hip structure, his hide, his color, there's just a lot of reasons why that bull, he's just kind of a tighter made bull. Just things look a little different with old Data Pack, but he did a lot. And then down there at the bottom, 2009 international champion, that's Hawk MANSO. He's out of the Ferguson division. And I believe he's a Saltillo, if I'm correct. And so Hawk, that's a pretty neat looking bull in terms of his structure, his balance. He's different pedigree wise than the ones on the left, but I've always been a fan of that bull, and he's still young yet to see him show up in a lot of pedigrees. But I'm predicting that as we move forward, there's going to be more of Hawk MANSO show up pedigree wise. All right, a name that needs no introduction, the great KARU, right? And we look at a extended pedigree of KARU, okay, and not to be redundant, but look at both of his maternal grandmothers. So both of KARU's maternal grandmothers are sired by Remington. And so Remington, another kind of situation where he's making a very, very big impact out of that Dakota bull. Okay. And so KARU, sire of 380, sire of a lot of cattle that were very successful, one of the most widely used Brahman bulls in kind of recent times. And then we get into, I really like this picture and I like this bull and kind of showing how stories come full circle. Okay, the 901 bull, sired by 189. Okay, that 901 bull was the 1998 international champion. It says, I'm pretty sure that's right, 1998 international champion. He stood the test of time because he followed basic production principles. That bull was sound, he was masculine, he was fertile, and he had calving ease on his side. And so that 901 bull got used heavily. And actually, Brandon got kind of creative just to show you kind of how much stayability, I guess the best term, that bull has and had. Brandon dug into the tank and used 901 to make 382. And for those that aren't familiar with some of our pedigrees, 382 then became the mother of Boom Shakalaka, who is then the mother of Dutton, Boombox, the list goes on. And so 901 over 4, remember that bull. He was the 98 national champion. He actually, or international champion, excuse me, sire. The 2012, I believe, is that right, Brandon? 2012 was 382. 2013 national champion female, and I believe Jerry Douglas was the judge that year when 382 was the champion. But things starting to come full circle, hopefully, and we're starting to piece together the whole point of this discussion as we start to see the last outcross bull that we'll talk about that Hudgens went and grabbed to put into their outfit for some kind of new blood, and actually has a very, very big impact on the cattle that we've got here at BRC. It's a 65 over 2 bull. I've seen him written down as 65 over 2 and 65 over 3. And so it could just be kind of some history translation being a little bit funny. But I believe it's 65 over 2. Is that correct, Brandon? 65 over 2. We're going to go with 65 over 2. But that bull is an HK red Brahman bull, and how he came to be used in the Hudgens herd, excuse me, was Bubba Hudgens, I believe, was making some good red cattle at that point in time, and somehow this bull ended up breeding some cows there in the lock division, and ends up making an impact, a major one, specifically because he's the great-grandsire of Elmo. And I would say that's where we can attribute a lot of that reddish tint or those red tinged cattle that we see in our grays as we kind of look now in modern times. Goes back to this Vernon 65 over 2. Top right, that's a champion show bull that's a brother to Vernon 65 over 2. The picture on the left that's Vernon 65 over 2 himself. And then the bottom is the the grandsire of Vernon 65 over 2, and that's that Cherokee 489 bull. And as Brandon and I were talking about some pedigree stuff this morning, Henry Clay Kuntz actually considered that bull to kind of be the go-to, the MANSO basically of the red Brahman breed. And so we didn't get into red Brahmans much, but if you wanted to know kind of the pinnacle of red Brahman pedigrees, that Cherokee 489 is certainly in consideration for that discussion. Then we move into Elmo. We talked about, okay, that Vernon bull passing on some of that reddish tint, and you can see it in Elmo. We start to get a little more modern, and some of the phenotypes that we represent here at BRC are starting to show up in some of these ancestors we talked about. Elmo, son of Lawford, sire of the great Noble. Okay, we all know who Noble is, but he is out of, sorry, I'm admitting somebody. He's out of Lawford. He was the 2008 national champion, and this bull ended up obviously going on to sire great cattle. What was the point of discussing all of this? And we still got more to talk about, but I don't want this to just seem like story time, because knowing history without application kind of becomes a little bit of me standing on a soapbox and preaching. But what this can do for us is it can show us how we line breed, successful kind of examples of properly using line breeding. And we talk about increasing homozygosity, right? And so through line breeding, we're allowing ourselves to make a more consistent type. And you don't have to think much harder than that. And they did it in Hudgens when they bred MANSO to MANSO daughters. What they were doing with line breeding was making consistent type. The old adage says, when it works, it's line breeding. When they come out three-legged, that's inbreeding. And so that's one thing we can learn. Another thing that we'll talk about is knowing when to outcross. And I added some slides talking about those Hudgens cattle and kind of their mission. And you can study the way they bred cattle is they They lined them up and they continued kind of lining them up, and then they found an outcross, and boom, successful matings, and their cattle had a little bit of a boost in terms of their genetic capabilities because of finding an outcross. And then we talk about, like I said, we line cattle up to increase consistency. And there's a lot of negatives associated with line breeding because people commonly and wrongly assume that line breeding makes messed up things happen. And that is not the case. Line breeding exposes any kind of genetic deficiency in those cattle. And so how do you know if an animal has a genetic defect? Breed him to his daughter or a few of his daughters. And before they got to the point where we could draw DNA out and test for these genetic kind of issues, that was the only way you could tell if a bull was carrying a genetic disease or some kind of deficiency in phenotype, was to breed him to his daughters. And that way we're lining up those genes, and those negative ones will certainly be highlighted. There we'll move into. Okay, I'll take us through this as we get to it, but I think this is probably my favorite portion of this discussion. Okay, and so I won't tell you the bull on the end, but just know he's an influential modern bull that's in a lot of kind of people's breeding systems now. But this is his full pedigree mapped out. And I got to work with Dr. Jim Sanders there at A&M, and me and him mostly. But I was glad to be a part of this project to help piece this together. Okay, and so y'all can see my mouse, right? So we see my mouse right there, and we start to look, and I'll go back to it and show us some more detail. This section right here, that's our 1906 importation. So all of those major black lines, excuse me, that's our 1924. This is our 1906 stuff. This is our 1924, so our roofier cattle right here. So we're talking about Maroto, Imperator, Aristocrata. Okay, this section right here, so this one bull that all of these are coming back to, I'm sure you can all guess, that's MANSO. Okay, then we start to get into a more of a cluster here. There's REXCRATA MANSO. Okay, and we get down in this direction, there's your Remington MANSO up here. And so I'll zoom us in and show us all, but I think you have to really back up to see the magnitude. I literally cannot count how many arrows are going back to MANSO. And so then you'd have to think, well, how many arrows then in turn are directly going back to Aristocrata, right? And so the magnitude that these animals have influenced the type and specifically made Brahman cattle what they are today. That's how we form a breed, right, is by breeding animals of a consistent type together to make a similar kind that we will eventually call a breed. And we named the Brahman was by really concentrating these bloodlines and making similar type, okay? Now, how does this impact where we are as far as the modern cattle we see, okay? This is Noble, and I'm sure everybody on this call has heard of Noble, so we won't spend any time introducing Noble, but let's look back through Noble's pedigree. And I talked about Elmo, I talked about Lawford, but more importantly, I want to push further back into 3, 4 generations, and we see Madison, like I talked about, Mount Rushmore type front runner kind of a bull. We see that 65/2, okay, coming from MANSO, that red bull. Now look, as we start to count, okay, we've got Remington. Okay, then we've got 202/3, who we know goes back to Remington. We've got 700/3, okay. Now we're gonna look at another pedigree. Oh, I don't know what I just did. There we go. We look at another pedigree, and this is 21/8, right? So Boom Shakalaka, as a lot of us know of. And let's look at her pedigree. Okay, so we count. We've got another Remington. Okay, we've got another 1, 2, 700/3. We got another Remington down there at the bottom, and I can't see through the kind of our bottom there because we've got the zoom title there. Oh, yep, one more Remington. I thought there was one more. Okay, and so we start to count, and we figure out how much, like really, what is the prevalence? Because we say like, oh yeah, he had a big impact. Cool, what does that mean? Well, let's look at kind of the finished product, or what we think of as kind of the modern Brahman prototype and what it took to get there. And so this is Dutton, right? 376. And Dutton himself has got 3 shots of 700 over 3. That's the 91 international champion, 700 over 3. I told you he would come up a bunch. He's got 9 shots of Remington. So Remington goes back, or Remington shows up, excuse me, in Dutton's pedigree 9 times. Maru, which we didn't get back that far. We only went 4, and you needed to get like 5, 6, probably 7 to get to him. But Maru showed up 12 times in Dutton's pedigree. REXCRATA won another 12 times in Dutton's pedigree. And MANSO, well over 50 times did he show up in Dutton's pedigree. Well, what, outside of that just being really incredible to think about, maybe that should limit some of our fear of a little bit of line breeding. If you get back enough generations, it really, all it's doing is making for a consistent type. But then also think about it this way. So MANSO went back to MANSO multiple times, as did every bull that we listed above. So 700 over 3, Remington, Maru, REXCRATA. There was other bulls that showed up multiple times. Every single one of them goes back to MANSO at least. I'd say REXA is just a couple, but the rest of those are probably at minimum 30 times. So we start to see the impact of what MANSO did in concentrating. You have to just, I mean, like I said, I wanted to talk about some of those bulls that I think push him as far as their impact, but there's still no argument on who the big guy was that made the most of an impact as we start to look. But we look at Dutton's pedigree, some of the ranches that we have to certainly appreciate what they did as far as supplying some of these genetics. Hudgens obviously shows up, but then some different ones. We've got HK cattle in his 7th-generation pedigree. So we're talking in the past 20 years, we've got HK cattle, we've got 3X cattle, okay? We've got a whole bunch of Sugar Corporation breeding in these pedigrees. Also, one that maybe people didn't notice would show up quite as much, we've got those Whitaker cattle, we've got cattle from Watts, we've got those Jack Keel bloodlines. And so it really, as a historian and as somebody who just appreciates the journey, it's impressive to think about how many mating decisions of other people that you've influenced to kind of turn these cattle into what they are today. I put 4 sires, no offense to any of the other ones, and like I said, MANSO is in a league of his own, but I put 4 sires that me, as kind of evaluating type, the bulls I thought directly had the most influence on phenotype through kind of how many times I saw them in the pedigree and then similarities and features that I saw. And those 4 bulls are not the same at all. Those 4 bulls, as far as their body types, are different. Rexa versus Suva couldn't be more different, but I see features that each one of them gave. And we talk about some of the breed character features and some of the body depth and keeping ability, fleshing ability. Rexa had a huge influence on maybe Dutton's body type as far as his rib, his moderation. Remington, Suva, those bulls added some style and still some growth. Okay, we've got 404. That bull did a ton as far as just the, helping add body and bone and mass. And so I put those 4 bulls, and if you want to kind of study some of your pedigrees at home, I challenge you to potentially see how many times they show up for your cattle, and I would assume it's pretty high. Okay, but that's where we're at today. I want to show y'all now, before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to pull this up so that everybody could see it. And I hope it doesn't skip around too much, but just the magnitude of what we're talking about, okay? And so this is just a little, excuse me if it jumps around a little bit, my computer's loading. This right here is just a little over 100 years, okay? And so when our great grandkids are raising Brahman cattle, Can you imagine what that pedigree is going to look like? So this right here, can you see everything just fine over there? Oh, they can't see it? Nothing? What do y'all see? Uh-oh. Give me 1 second. Let's see. I'm trying to figure this out. Still doesn't? What do I do here?
Black screen now. Now it's you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now we're going. Now does it look right?
Yes. Now I got it.
Okay, let me get it all pulled up. I want everybody to see this because I think this is really, really neat. Okay, so this is an Excel pedigree like I talked about. Lots of credit to Dr. Sanders. This is not me taking full credit. This is just me helping kind of show off his work because I think he is a legend and a huge, huge influence on me. But like I talked about, this is just a little over 100 years, okay, of Brahman breeding. I talked about we won't highlight whose pedigree this is. You might even be able to see it at the top. I don't know. But let's just take a peek. Can you see it? Oh. Let's just take a peek at kind of some important spots, should you say. And so I'm sorry, my computer's jumping around. We're a little slow. Let me see. Let me zoom in real quick. Okay. So let's just look at a few of these really, really heavy places. Let's go back all the way to the beginning because I did not go over a couple of animals that certainly still need to be mentioned. You see two, and this would be the early 1900s, the very, very first cattle that we'll talk about showing up in pedigree, circles and TIPPU. Okay, and so circles and TIPPU. And then we move on just a little further into our 1924 cattle. Okay, and then like I said, me personally, from my own research and just looking at lots of these pedigrees, I think Maroto, okay, and Rodrigo had almost as much of an impact. And don't take this as me sliding MANSO in any way. We all know what he's done. But Maroto and Rodrigo. So here's Maroto right there. Okay, and so you look at how many arrows go back to Maroto, and here's Rodrigo right here. Okay, and then you follow Rodrigo's arrows. Okay, they go right down here to all those MANSO daughters, or excuse me, to all of those cattle that got bred to MANSO to make a lot of those good first generation sons. And so we've got MANSO here, right? So let's look there. We got Maroto. We've got Rodrigo right here. Okay. There's QUINCA right here. And so he doesn't directly get arrows to him quite as much, but his kind of second, third generation arrows become very, very important. Let's see. So here we've got a lot of MANSO's first generation offspring. Okay, we're getting into, let me see if I can scroll over without messing this up. Okay, we get into, you see Risotto MANSO right there where my mouse is. That's a lot of arrows. So Risotto MANSO certainly needs a little bit of love. Okay, up here where my arrow is, Aristocrat MANSO. Now, what is important about Aristocrat MANSO that we talked about just a second ago? Okay, Aristocrat MANSO goes on to sire who? Anybody know? Nobody. Well, he becomes very important in talking about one of my other favorites. Looky here, Rex A. MANSO. Okay, so we've worked our way, and so we went from Aristocrat. There's the 20th right there, onto so Aristocrat, then Aristocrat the 20th, onto Rex A. MANSO. Okay, let's just make sure we give everybody their kind of due discussion and talk about a lot of these first generations sons that were important. There's Punka MANSO there. I want to find Manamoso MANSO. It's so hard to keep them all in line when it gets like this. I love, love, love Manamoso MANSO too, just because I think that's a teaching tool of how they did it back then to make sure that they can kind of conceived a a very consistent type was breeding sons to daughters. Okay. Well, I don't know where MANSO is. Pedigree's gotten a little out of control. Okay, we've got REXCRATA there, 1/5, so we're talking 40s. Okay, and then let's slide on and let's see things that get a lot of arrows, a little more recent, right? So we've got premium MANSO. Okay, that's a lot. And then we talked about the bulls of the 50s and 60s, and I said I really like Rachu MANSO, okay, and Swato MANSO, okay, and even Errol MANSO and Salim. All these bulls right here at the top, those are those bulls, and just a heavy influx of relationship between them. And if you get a chance, tune in. I guess it'll be, is it a month from now, or when we talk about inbreeding coefficients, and I'll teach you the science behind some of these kind of things and how that impacts type. We'll move on just a little bit further, and let's see. There's Maru. Right, so looky there. Look at all the lines going to Maru. We're getting a lot closer. Okay, and this is not Dutton or 21's pedigree, so it's going to be just a little bit different. Okay, but there's Maru. Let's see, and then there's Remington, and Remington actually has more of an impact on Dutton than this particular individual. But there you have. Maru. Let's see. I want to find REXCRATA 1. He's in here somewhere, causing a lot of chaos. Man, I apologize that this is so difficult to navigate, but at least you can see the complexity of it all. It's so complex that I can't even find anything. No, maybe I'm not going to find REXCRATA. You get the concept. Just the depth that this goes. I will now, I guess, open for any kind of discussion. I'll blow it back up so everybody can kind of see the big picture, right? And so I don't know how many animals are in this pedigree. I could probably find out, but I don't know how many animals are in that pedigree. So before anybody asks that, I don't know. Any questions? More than welcome. Okay, type, yeah, if you have a question, I was told to type it in. Go ahead and type in your question, and then they'll relay it to me, and I will relay it forward. Do what? If you want to, you can unmute and ask it to where everybody can hear it. That would be fine too. I'm open for whatever. We're a little short. I was a little, well, that was probably about as long as I thought it was going to be, but we have time for questions, so don't be shy.
Can you tell us who that bull was?
I'll tell you.
I was like, can people type in the chat who their guess is?
Yeah, if you guess it, I'll tell you. I don't think anybody will guess it. It wasn't a bull that was in the slideshow. It wasn't a bull in the slideshow. It is a national. It is. I believe he was a national champion. I also think he was either an international champion or a reserve. But it didn't take long for the enthusiasts in the room with me to figure out who the bull was. The reason being that this is the bull that we did was because this is my mentor's favorite bull. Dr. Jim Sanders loves this particular bull.
We have a question.
Okay, we got a question. What's the question?
It says, looking at this pedigree, what determines who is in this chart or pedigree?
If someone hasn't taken Dr. Sanders' class, they may not know what all the lines mean.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I get what you're saying. I went too far into detail before I really broke down what's going on. Okay, so what this is, so we've got everything mapped out chronologically. Okay, so every, I guess we'll call that a column. So CR, CQ, CP, that's a year. That's 1 year. Okay, and we've got all of these animals. I want to go back to where earlier years so you can see it really easy. Okay, and so these arrows, if it is a solid line, and you can't tell because it's not even zoomed in enough. Let me zoom in a little further. If it is a solid line, that is the sire. Okay, so where the arrow, so see aristocrata, he's a solid line, or that means that aristocrata is the sire of all these arrows that are pointing. If it is a dotted line, okay, that is the mother, that is the female. So you follow like anxiety last right here would be the mother of, it's too far to tell, Miss Suba the 15th. Okay, so like for instance, let's look at Miss Suba the 15th. I don't know that cow in particular, but just to talk about her. So she would be out of that anxiety last cow. And I'm going to assume the old Suva bull, but let's just click on this arrow and see. So I can quickly jump down here and see, yep, the old Suva bull, the original Suva. And so what that means, yeah, that these, so you can look at MANSO and I could click, I could count, it hurts my eyes to even look at it, but you can click on the arrow, okay, and find all of his offspring. So there's one, it's hard because you got to really scroll. Okay, so that's Clarice's MANSO. That's one of his daughters. How do I look at those? Does anybody know?
We can read them to you.
Yeah, what's the next one? So hopefully that made it, at least you understand how to read what's going on here. You have to work backwards to get this. So I can't start at MANSO and find the end. I start with whoever, if I wanted to do Dutton, I would start with Dutton, map out his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on until you get to where you can't go any further back.
In your opinion, which 3 bulls are the most influential sires of the last 20 years?
Last 20 years? That's a tough one because I don't think we've lived long enough to really see it. I know here, it would be hard to say that ELMO isn't just a huge impact on this breeding program, okay? And then you would also get KARU from a lot of the 380 breedings, but that's not true for everybody yet. I think we need probably 40 years or something to really see my top 3, but I love, well, that's not even 20 years. I want to say I love Remington, but we're way past that. Liberty, I love Liberty. But if we're talking like 20 years, we'd have to talk about bulls like ELMO. We'd have to talk about bulls like 380. Noble will be one of those bulls that he's going to have a bunch of arrows that go back to him. And that's kind of exciting to think about. I haven't really thought about that, but if we did this in 30 years, I would say that the animal breeding classes at A&M are going to be like, oh yeah, and there you can see that's Noble, and there's going to be 30 arrows that go back to him. But to answer your question, I don't think there's really an answer to your question just quite yet. But you heard a few that I thought ELMO, 380 would be huge for us. And so in my opinion, those would be 2 of my top 3 for sure. I'll throw Woodson in there just for Woodson or Woodmen. I guess either way, that kind of is the same.
Is REXCRATA 204 the ideal Brahman?
Yeah, in the standard of excellence stuff. I think that, well, we've probably, everybody on this chat, I don't know who asked that question, but all of us on that chat have been to a cattle show or some form of cattle exhibition. And a lot of us have seen what was our favorite animal not get beat. And so phenotype is what we would consider to be a very objective trait, right? So there's a lot of differences in opinion, but that is a very good bull to look at for what we'd consider the ideal phenotype. Got another question?
We want to know the person who asked who the top 3 are. They would like to share their.
Oh yeah. So I don't know who asked me. Fabio, would you tell me? So I told you my top 3. I said 380, ELMO, and Woodson or Woodman, right? I think those 2 both because Woodson is a Woodman. But those are my top 3. But I would love to hear your top 3. So that is my question for you. What are your top 3? You can type it in the chat box, or you can just unmute and tell me.
Yeah. Well, I think that my top three are it's 380/6 V8, and it comes from one of my favorites. Is the KARU bull. Another one is Woodman and his son Woodson. And the other one, I would say, is not direct from the last 20 years, but it's MADISON, and he's several offsprings because he's got several very good top outstanding bulls.
We have a very, very similar opinion on that. And like you said, it Woodman or Woodson, that kind of is the same. And then the KARU 380, because they directly are going to go through each other. So Madison's probably outside of the 20 years. So that's why I didn't put him on my list. But if we backed it up, right? So just a little bit further and went 30 years. Madison, like I talked about earlier, he's in the argument to be on my Mount Rushmore. So I like that bull. No more questions. If anybody's got a question, now would be a good time. Thank you, Fabio. I appreciate kind of your input. I couldn't agree with you anymore.
You're welcome.
Oh, I see. If you see the Dutton pedigree, can you see his bloodline? Like, is he interfered?
We got a question.
Is he an Imperator bull or Risotto bull or a mix of mini Brahmans? How would you breed him with females if I'm looking for a breeding program using, well, what would be the main sire influence of Dutton, he's saying? Is it Imperator?
No. Yeah, if we were talking about Dutton and we wanted to, I don't know who asked this question, but they were asking, Jesus asked what I would consider to be the main bloodline per se. And you see all these arrows, so it's really, really hard to say the main. Is he Imperator? Is he this? If I had to directly line him back up to a single bull, and I think the picture says it, and we looked at the pictures in comparison, of historic kind of sires, REXCRATA MANSO is the most similar to him in type. And I thought it went back a lot. As far as asking what type of cows you would breed him to, I honestly think that he complements a lot of different cows. From a bloodline perspective, he brings together kind of some different features. And then from a phenotype perspective, we talk about him being kind of what we consider the modern prototype of what we think a Brahman ought to look like. And so I'd say there's a lot of choices of cows that would complement Dutton well.
So looking back or forward, can we move forward using bulls from the 70s if we still have semen on them?
That is one of the
Repeat
the question was looking back or looking forward. Can we move forward with bulls, using bulls from the 70s if we still have semen on them? I will say, if you think the cattle from the 70s are better than the ones that you have now, then maybe, but just keep in mind that we selectively bred them and we've made what we consider to be improvements on them. And if you look back at phenotype, I would say in the right situation where you had a cow that was an extreme outlier for a particular kind of body type, maybe you could find a bull easier from a previous, I don't know if 70s would be where I went, but a previous generation to complement her. But I do think that's a complicated discussion that I don't know if I have the best answer for. No more questions. Well, I think that's the end of it, and I appreciate, I see some familiar faces, but a lot of y'all I don't know, and I hope to get to meet y'all going forward as we get to work together. But I appreciate y'all tuning in, and you can contact me. You can find my email or my phone number on website, Keaton@brarchitrare.com. You can email me whatever questions you have, and we can kind of work together going forward. But thank y'all once again for tuning in. We'll go ahead and sign out. Hopefully see y'all next month talking about inbreeding coefficients. Am I done?